So I've prepared this talk for you this afternoon, for this session, on, as Charles said, the subject of Hezbollah, say Lebanese Hezbollah. There is, of course, other Hezbollah organizations, but Lebanese Hezbollah as a case study of an anti-Semitic Shia Islamist group. And it's very interesting, as we'll go on to see, that the Islamist aspect, of course, is important in understanding Hezbollah's perspective on this, but the specific Shia Islamic aspect is very fascinating and unique as well in understanding the particular form, if we can put it that way, of anti-Jewish political and military thinking and organization, which is characterized by Lebanese Hezbollah. So let me get straight to it then and begin with a quote. And this is a quote from Hezbollah Secretary General, current Secretary General, which his name is Hassan Nasrallah, who probably you've all heard of. And he says the following: "But I'll tell you, among the signs and signals which guide us in the Islamic prophecies, and not only in the Jewish prophecies, is that this state of Israel will be established, and that the Jews will gather from all parts of the world into occupied Palestine, not in order to bring about the Antichrist and the end of the world, but rather that Allah, the glorified and most high, wants to save you from having to go to the ends of the world. For they have gathered in one place, and there the final and decisive battle will take place." Close quotes. This is Nasrallah speaking before an audience in Beirut in 2002. And much, as we'll go on to see, of Hezbollah's attitude toward the Jews may be discerned from this quote. This statement, and indeed the movement's outlook regarding the Jews, manages a kind of seamless combination of anti-Israeli and anti-Israeli and anti-Jewish sentiment, in which the politicidal ambitions regarding Israel are frankly and unambiguously located within an anti-Jewish worldview. And this worldview, in turn, is theological and essentialist in nature. Israel is seen as iniquitous in its essence, not because it represents a deviation from Jewish doctrines or outlook, as in some other anti-Zionist formulations emerging from the Islamic Middle East have it, but rather because it is the realization of this essence, as foreseen, according to Nasrallah, in both Islamic and Jewish scripture. In this regard, and this I guess is the first specific point regarding Hezbollah's difference and uniqueness and interesting nature, in this regard Hezbollah's anti-Semitism is quite separate from a notable strain in the West of anti-Semitic anti-Zionism, which seeks to argue for the inauthenticity of Israel, and which dismisses modern Jewish or Israeli claims to commonality with ancient Israel as spurious or constructed. It's interesting to note, as an aside, the possible derivation of views of that kind from a sort of Christian supersessionist outlook, which regard the Jews as having completed their historic role and possessing no justifiable claim for continued communal existence. Such views usually seek to depict Israel as a phenomenon analogous to Western settler colonialism. I'm sure you're all familiar with this type of outlook. Similar to Western settler colonialism, lacking any deep roots in Jewish history or any deep roots in the Levant region, and so on and so forth. Hezbollah makes no claims of this kind. Hezbollah is not there with that whole style. It does not regard Israel as a modern phenomenon, falsely claiming links to the ancient Jews for the purpose of justifying a settler colonial project. Rather, Lebanese Hezbollah pays Israel and Zionism the dubious compliment of locating it as an entirely authentic, historically and theologically rooted expression of the Jewish communal essence. And it then goes on to define this essence as entirely evil and nefarious in nature, and destined to make war against the Islamic world until it is defeated by the latter. This vision, as we shall go on to see, lies at the root of Hezbollah's perception of the Jews and Israel. This view differs also from the usual formal declaration of Arab or Islamic anti-Zionism, according to which Jews, as a people of the book, Ahl al-Kitab, have a legitimate and respected place as a religious minority, but no national rights. Interestingly, Hezbollah leaders sometimes pay lip service to this latter view. As we shall go on to see, one may locate various statements by Hezbollah spokesmen and leaders expressly denying accusations of anti-Jewish prejudice on the part of the movement, and rather declaring acceptance of the Jews as one of the peoples of the book, deserving of the right to a peaceful communal life under Islamic rule and to freedom of worship. How can one explain this apparent contradiction? That's to say, between what we heard Nasrallah saying at the beginning and the notion of the Jews as a people deserving nevertheless a certain level of respect and tolerance. Should it be concluded that Hezbollah spokesmen are simply lying when rejecting claims of anti-Jewish prejudice, because they're aware of the negative publicity effects this could generate for the movement in the West? In an arena, by the way, where the relative tolerance of Western governments for the movement's activities has proven of clear benefit? And if so, what are the roots, Islamic or otherwise, of the movement's authentic, virulently anti-Semitic stance? Or indeed, is there a way whereby these two apparently contradictory stances can be reconciled? That is, whereby a coherent ideological outlook might be assembled, according to which the Jews are an evil and iniquitous communal body, and are nevertheless to be permitted a legitimate, if powerless, communal existence under certain conditions. Examining this question, and I think it's the crucial question with regard to Hezbollah, requires a deeper look at the form and the roots and the expressions of Hezbollah's stance regarding the Jews and Israel, which I now want to try to delve into. Sheikh Naim Qasim, a name which not everybody here necessarily will be familiar with, but Sheikh Naim Qasim is a person who's often described as the number two in Hezbollah, or at least the number one even in terms of ideology and intellectual output. And Sheikh Naim Qasim, in his book Hezbollah, The Story from Within, characterizes the motivations behind Zionism in the following terms, and I'm quoting again. The Zionist project was formed with a focus on religious fanaticism and Semitic prejudice, using the most dreadful of methods to achieve the project's aims. Elsewhere, Qasim writes, the basic foundation of the racially prejudiced Zionist movement is expansion, an aim supported by religious foundations drawn from the Torah. Again, note the respect given to the fact that this is not seen as something new and white and European. This is deeply rooted in the authentic Jewish essence. So far, so good, right? It's just that the authentic essence is dreadful and evil in Sheikh Naim Qasim's view, so we don't get to benefit from the deal. According to the Torah, says Sheikh Naim Qasim, Palestine is an inheritance for the people of Israel, whose lives will not stabilize except through the expulsion of Palestine's original inhabitants. Similarly, Ayatollah Muhammad Hussein Fadlallah, again a name maybe not familiar to everybody here, but a very, very important figure in the Middle East politics and history of the last half century, I would say, and one of the chief ideological fathers of Hezbollah. Fadlallah also located this supposed motivation of Zionism within a supposed inherent Jewish desire for power. And quoting again from Fadlallah now, the Jews want to be a world superpower. This racist circle of Jews wants to take vengeance on the whole world for their history of persecution and humiliation. In this light, says Fadlallah, the Jews will work on the basis that Jewish interests are above all world interests. No one should imagine that the Jews act on behalf of any super or minor power. It is their personality to make for themselves a future world presence. And later, Naim Qassem discusses what he regards as the danger to the Muslims of the region, represented by Israel. And this discussion too is rooted in an Islamic theological view, which views the Jews as a uniquely cunning and malicious enemy. And Naim Qassem in this discussion cites two other figures, each of whom, as we shall see, is essential in understanding Hezbollah's views on Israel and the Jews. The first of these is Ayatollah Khomeini of Iran, and the second is the mythical, revered figure of the 12th Imam, Imam al-Mahdi, whose reappearance in 12th Shia eschatology, I suppose you would say, is meant to trigger the end days. I happen to bring with me a copy of Naim Qassem's main book, translated into English, Hezbollah, the Story from Within. So I would like, if I may, with your permission, and if I can find the right page, to quote a little bit, not at length, but to quote a decent portion, which I think exactly outlines Sheikh Naim Qassem's view in this regard. And once again, note the combination here of a sense of the Jews as an ancient collectivity or community, coupled with the sense of nefariousness and evil. Here is Sheikh Naim Qassem. Regarding the religious obligation, Jerusalem is the birthplace of the prophets and the land on which Prophet Muhammad treaded. Here Qassem himself is quoting from the Quran. Glory to Allah who did take his servant for journey by night from the sacred mosque to the furthest mosque, whose precincts we did bless, in order that we might show him some of our signs. For he is the one who heareth and seeth all things. You understand what this is referring to, of course. The furthest mosque is Al-Aqsa Mosque. This is the notion that in the Quran is already outlined, the fact that Al-Aqsa Mosque is located in Jerusalem. The furthest mosque is in Jerusalem. Very interesting for those of you who are students, or indeed some of you maybe are Muslims yourselves, you will know the fact that for Shia Muslims, traditionally Jerusalem was not of central importance. It was of much greater central importance to Sunni Muslims. But Sheikh Naim Qassem and the others in Hezbollah are introducing a notion of the centrality of Jerusalem for Shia Muslims. Sheikh Naim Qassem continues, it's not permissible to squander the land of Muslims or that which is sanctified. Rising to their defense and liberation is a natural obligation for which all Muslims are liable. As Imam Khomeini declared, and here he quotes Khomeini, the extortionist government of Israel, through its tendentious plans for Islamic nations and Muslims, represents a great danger. It is feared that confrontation may become impossible should Muslims show lassitude. Given that the danger is directed at the very essence of Islam, it is the duty of all Muslims, and specifically of Islamic states, to take the initiative for the obliteration of this pond of decay with all possible means, and not to decline the mujahideen any assistance towards this end. Mujahideen, everyone's familiar with the term, a person who makes jihad, of course. And here he quotes from a very crucial and central part of the Quran in terms of Hezbollah's thinking on this subject. And please, if it's of interest to you, this subject, listen carefully to this little quote. Qassem introduces it in the following way. Such danger has persisted and continues to manifest in destruction throughout our entire region, not to mention the pain we suffered as a result. We have been promised victory, for in God Almighty's words, and here he's quoting from the Quran, and we decreed for the children of Israel in the scripture, you verily will work corruption in the earth twice, and you will become great tyrants. So when the time for the first of the two came, we roused against you slaves of ours of great might, who ravaged your country, and it was a threat performed. And then we gave you once again your turn against them, and we aided you with wealth and children, and made you more in soldiery. If you do good, you do good for your own souls. If you do evil, it is for them in like manner. So when the time for the second of the judgments came, we roused against you others of our slaves to ravage you and to enter the temple, even as they entered it the first time, and to lay waste all that they conquered with an utter wasting. It may be that your Lord will have mercy on you, but if you repeat the crime, we shall repeat the punishment. And we have appointed hell a dungeon for the disbelievers. This is a strong and powerful stuff, as you can, I'm sure, or as I hope you can hear. And it is also very located. As I say, it's locating the notion of the destruction of the modern state of Israel in an ancient theology and eschatology. Just a last little quote from Sheikh Naim, and then we'll continue. Sheikh Naim Qasim talks also about Hezbollah. Here he has the basic statement of what this movement is in the eyes of its own adherents. He says, "One sect of my people shall uphold their religion, conquer their enemy, and will never be harmed by any assailant except that which befalls them of distress and hardship, and they will remain as such until God's order comes unto them." When asked where this party is, the Prophet said, in Beit al-Maqdis, Jerusalem, and under its wings. And tradition also speaks of the appearance of the 12th Imam, Imam al-Mahdi, who will work to purify Jerusalem. Thus far then, with regard both to Sheikh Naim and therefore Hezbollah's view of Israel and the Jews, and its view of itself and its role in the supposed destruction of Israel. Here we have then the essential components of Hezbollah's view on this subject. An essential Jewish identity is seen as the causal factor behind Zionism and the establishment of Israel. The location of the understanding of this identity is in Islamic texts, and importantly, the location of the resistance to this entity, ending in its destruction, is placed in a specific 12 Shia eschatology. Thus far with regard to Sheikh Naim Qasim. Amel Saad Ghorayeb, a British Lebanese researcher who is supportive herself of Hezbollah, in her book Hezbollah, Politics and Religion, best sums up this point in the following terms. I'm going to quote a little bit from Amal, and after that it'll be all my own words, I promise you. Where are we? Yeah, I'm quoting Amal Saad Ghorayeb also, as maybe you can assume, because she herself is a supporter of Hezbollah, right? And she's a supporter and not an apologist, to her credit. As to say, she doesn't try to make out that, well, actually Hezbollah is not so bad, and they've been she states openly and clearly what the movement's outlook is, regardless of the way it might sound to Western ears. And she says the following with regard to Hezbollah's view of the Jews. I'm quoting. "In effect, Hezbollah's professed distinction between Judaism and Zionism is merely an attempt to give the benefit of the doubt to the small number of non-Israeli Jews who oppose Zionism. To all intents and purposes, the negligible number of anti-Zionist Jews has enabled Hezbollah to closely identify Judaism with Zionism. It has also contributed to the use of the term Jewish as an epithet for Zionist, and to the usage by the movement of both terms interchangeably." Now here's the important bit. One may contend that the synonymy of the two terms in Hezbollah's lexicon and the general equation of Zionism with Judaism merely signify that all Zionists are necessarily Jews, although doubtless the party would admit to the existence of non-Jewish Zionists rather than indicate that all Jews are Zionists. However, to do so would be to ignore the party's extensive derogation of Judaism as a religion, irrespective of its Zionist offshoot. In light of the party's anti-Judaism, its claim to differentiate Judaism from Zionism becomes purely academic. Even if some Jews do not espouse Zionism, their religion is still rejected. Whether or not Jews champion Zionism is therefore immaterial, for their religion is held responsible for the birth of Zionism. That the overwhelming majority of Jews happen to be Zionists, by Hezbollah's reckoning, only highlights the Judaic origins of Zionism and greatly facilitates the close identification between two doctrines which are perceived to be equally iniquitous. There's another quote here, but maybe I'll get back to it later on. I think you get the point. The point is the following. In practice, this conflation of the establishment and existence of Israel with the supposedly nefarious, power-seeking plans of the Jews opens the door to the embrace by Hezbollah of a variety of forms of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic rhetoric, including elements which have no relation of any kind to Hezbollah's own core Shia Islamic outlook. And indeed, a perusal of statements and programming by Hezbollah propaganda outlets and by the movement's spokespeople and leaders unsurprisingly produces rapidly a rich harvest of classical anti-Semitic prejudice, indistinguishable in many ways from the traditional language of the European far right, or indeed in certain circumstances of the European far left. Here then is a little taster of this phenomenon, just to prove to you I'm not just making all this stuff up. So, in a 1998 speech marking the day of Ashura, people I think are familiar with this day when Shia people remember the martyrdom of Hussein. And this is from Hassan Nasrallah's official website in Arabic. We've translated it. Nasrallah refers to Israel as the state of the grandsons of apes and pigs, the Zionist Jews. And he goes on to make a statement which is probably the most famous statement by Nasrallah, which really, in a way, sealed the book on any claim that... No, that's going on like that. I think it's just somebody dropped some stuff. It's not to worry. Hopefully it's not Nasrallah coming in to take issue with my misquoting. So this quote is seen by many as establishing really or sealing the book rather, on any discussion regarding anti-Judaism versus anti-Zionism in the case of Hezbollah. Nasrallah says the following briefly. If we search the entire world for a person more cowardly, despicable, weak and feeble in psyche, mind, ideology and religion, we would not find anyone like the Jew. Notice, I do not say the Israeli. Thus says Nasrallah. He himself apparently was wishing to end any ambiguity in this regard. Hezbollah celebrates Holocaust denial too. Jews invented the legend of the Holocaust, says Nasrallah, on April 9th, 2000. And during an appearance on Al-Manar, the movement's main media channel, on February 3rd of that year, Nasrallah called Europe's leading Holocaust denier at that time, Roger Giraudi, a name probably familiar to some people here, a great French philosopher. On February 23rd of that year, Nasrallah once again on Al-Manar praises another leading European Holocaust denier, one David Irving, native of these shores on which we are currently located, and he praises him for having denied the existence of gas chambers. One fatwa or religious edict issued by Iranian clerics even provides Lebanese Shia drug dealers with a theological basis for their business activities with Western consumers. It says the following: we're making drugs for Satan, America and the Jews. If we cannot kill them with guns, so we'll kill them with drugs. And Nasrallah elsewhere describes Israel as, quoting again, a few million vagabonds from all over the world brought together by their Talmud and Jewish fanaticism. Al-Manar TV, the movement's main propaganda outlet, is similarly a regular purveyor of openly anti-Jewish sentiment. Thus, in one 2002 broadcast quoted by US researcher Matthew Levitt, a guest informs viewers that, quoting, there are Torah-based reasons for the Americans to use WMD. Therefore, it is essential that there be a world and Arab movement against this Torah-based project. This is a Torah-based plan to finish all Islam. And similarly, in another broadcast quoted by Levitt, Sheikh Taha al-Sabunji, a leading cleric in northern Lebanon, warned in April 2002 that Judaism was, quote, a project against all humanity. He also denied the premise on which, according to him at least, Hezbollah officials had recently begun to rely on, namely that Zionism is separate from Judaism. He says, there's no such thing as Zionism, there is only Judaism. Zionism is a legend, a myth. In 2004, Al-Manar famously at the time, it's a few years ago now, aired a series in Arabic called Al-Shatat, which means the diaspora, which included the concept of the blood libel. In the relevant scene, a Jewish rabbi plots to find a Christian child to sacrifice, and the chosen boy begs for mercy, addressing one of the Jews by name, and has his throat slit and his blood collected for the making of Pesach matzah. Of course, you're familiar with the blood libel. Hezbollah's anti-Semitism also parlays modern-day conspiracy theories. Less than a week after 9/11, an Al-Manar broadcast posited that Israelis and Jews were complicit in the attacks. By this account, some 4,000 Jews survived the attacks because Israeli intelligence warned them in time of the disaster, and they didn't go into work on September 11th. And similarly, Hezbollah leaders alternately deny the Holocaust, which we already saw, or claim that the Jews themselves intentionally incited it. In 1998, Mohammed Raad, the head of Hezbollah's political council, said, I'm quoting, "From what we know of the Jews, their tricks and their deceptions, we do not think it unlikely that they partook in the planning of the Holocaust. At a minimum, they prepared the foreground which incited the Nazis to the Holocaust killings so they could serve their settlement project in Palestine." Again, some of these arguments you're probably familiar with from other sources. This is downstream from the theology, so to speak, which we discussed earlier. And in a certain sense, once you get downstream from the theology, then Hezbollah can meet up with some of the other more familiar claims regarding Israel and Zionism. Hezbollah's anti-Semitism also sometimes achieves the quality of farce. As an example, in 2014, Al-Manar aired a program claiming that Jews had themselves invented a number of Hollywood movies, and even Hollywood itself, in order to subversively insert Jewish superiority into American and thence global culture. And Al-Manar says, here I'm quoting, "Because Jews felt rejected by real American society, they tried to change society's opinion of them by inventing cinematic characters that would serve as role models." And she goes on to cite the example of Superman, who, in her opinion at least, only fitted into society, we all know the story of Superman, of course, by taking on the pathetic persona, this is what this lady says, of Clark Kent. I don't think it's fair to say Clark Kent is pathetic, but no, this is Al-Manar. According to the narrator, the Jews, through the figure of Clark Kent, slyly imply that their weak public face or exterior hides their true superhuman identity. Hollywood, she continues, is a Jewish invention that changed the way Americans view America. Undoubtedly, the goal was to take over the greatest superpower in the world. This, to Western ears, of course, sounds somewhat ridiculous. But it's worth remembering, I mean, joking or humor aside, that the Arabic-speaking world is a milieu in which anti-Jewish prejudice is normative and mainstream. As the late Bernard Lewis put it, the societal norm for attitudes towards Jews in the Arab world resembles that of pre-1939 Europe. So much of the evidence recorded here would be regarded as unremarkable in contemporary mainstream Arab discourse among both friends of Hezbollah and its opponents. This doesn't in any way lessen, of course, the openly and blatantly anti-Semitic nature of this content. And the examples quoted in previous minutes exhaustively are just a small sample, but it does show the extent to which this is mainstream. This is not departing in many ways from mainstream discourse in the Arabic-speaking world. I know this morning you were discussing the Abraham Accords, and certainly there's much to be encouraged, to find encouraging, finally, in terms of some of the actions that UAE and others are taking in this regard. But for most of our lives, for many years, this type of discussion has been mainstream. In this regard, it's important, I think, now to introduce another element into the Hezbollah mix. And this is the traditional emphasis in Shia Islam, specifically, of the issue of ritual purity. In Hebrew we say tohar, right? Tohar, tahor, pure. And in Arabic it's the same word, tahara. And there's another word, najasat, which means impurity. And among strict Shia Muslims, non-Muslims were included in the list of unclean things, contact with which produced a state of ritual impurity in Muslims, along with such substances and creatures as wine and pigs and carrion and fecal matter and so on. And Iranian Shia authorities were traditionally extremely strict in this regard. As a result, in the early 19th century, restrictive rules were imposed on Jews, preventing them, for example, from going out of their houses when it was raining, on the assumption that their impurities would be passed on to Muslims through the water. By the early 20th century, such practices were falling into decline. Possible, by the way, and this is a little bit of a theological aside, but it's possible some observers or writers consider that these practices entered Shia Islam by way of Zoroastrianism. They have their roots, as I say, in pagan and pre-monotheistic beliefs. Certainly they're unknown to mainstream Sunni Islam. This is very specific to Shia Islam. As I said, they declined for a while. Those of you, or those of us who have met people from Shia communities also in Pakistan, also in Iran, will be familiar maybe with some of these type of thinking. But the important point for us to note for the sake of our discussion this afternoon is that these notions have been revived very strongly by Khomeini and the Islamic Revolution in Iran. In a widely circulated book on the subject, Khomeini included unbelievers in a list of items he deemed unclean. He included also carrion, wine, beer, urine, and a number of other phenomena. Which means that the Iranian Shia Islamist milieu, which has revived such notions and brought them back into circulation, if we can put it that way, is the one in which Hezbollah is a part. So this context should also be taken into account when considering the movement's attitude to Jews. I mentioned those with knowledge of Shia communities can be aware of this. Let me just give a short anecdote from a friend of mine in Israel, whose father is from Baghdad, and who told the story that when his father was a young boy in Baghdad, prior to the destruction of that, or the departure of that community in 1951, his father took him to the market in Baghdad, and the boy, as his father then was with his father, my friend's grandfather, and a trader who was a Shia trader of fruit said to my friend's grandfather, his father's father, why do you let your son touch these fruit, these dates? Now I have to throw away the whole box. You know I have to throw away the whole box now because the kid touched them. Why did you let him touch them? It's a wonderful anecdote, I think, not only because of what it shows you about the existence and prevalence of this type of belief, but also the anecdote contains within it the notion that the trader thinks that the Jewish person should regard this as normal also, right? He didn't get angry and insult the father. He just said, look, why are you letting the kid do that? Now I have to throw away, now I have to throw away the whole box. Whereas the ritual impurity of Jews is taken as a given, in which Jews themselves are expected to understand it as much as non-Jews. With all this, however, all this strangeness, it's also the case, nevertheless, that there are statements of some kind in which Hezbollah leaders have spoken of Jews as people of the book, who should have a recognized, if inferior, position in the properly ordered Islamic society, which is Hezbollah's goal. Thus, 30th November 2009, while reading the party's new political manifesto, Nasrallah says, "Our problem with the Israelis is not that they are Jews, but that they are occupiers who are raping our land and holy places." And again, in a pro-Palestinian convention in Beirut in 2005, Hezbollah representative in the parliament, Abdullah Qusara, says, quote, "Hezbollah has never been against religions. Hezbollah supports all religions. It supports interfaith dialogue." Hey, my grandmother was interfaith. It supports interfaith dialogue noch. Yeah, Hezbollah is for interfaith dialogue. There we are. No problem with any religion. Hezbollah considers Zionism to be the enemy, not the Jews as a people or a religion. Even, here we are, a comment on the recent project for the rebuilding of the Magen Avram synagogue in Beirut, which some people may be familiar with. Hussein Rahal, a spokesman for Hezbollah, says the group supports the restoration of the synagogue. "We respect," he says, "the Jewish religion just like we do Christianity. The Jews have always lived among us. We have an issue with Israel's occupation of land." Once again, then we come back to the central question, how to explain this discrepancy. Amal Saad Ghorayeb, who we met before, the British Lebanese Hezbollah supporting researcher, does this by noting, I think quite simply and quite smartly, that the form of coexistence advocated by Hezbollah is of a particular minimal kind. In an interview with a Hezbollah official, she concludes the movement is, and I'm quoting, "compelled to abide by the dictates of Islamic jurisprudence and to recognize the Jews as a people of the book, who, despite their demonization in the Quran, cannot be the subject of jihad on that account alone. And Shia and Fayyad discussed the concept of, in Arabic they call it al-tasakun al-barid, cold cohabitation, whereby the Jews would be left to live in peace, because the conflict between the Jews and Islam is essentially ideological as opposed to existential, as in the case of Zionism. However, there will be no normalization with them. This, in contrast, by the way, to the rival concept of Tayush al-Mushtarak, joint coexistence, which the movement supports with regard to Christians. Does this then solve the contradiction? Have we reached the solution? Jews are to be accepted, but nevertheless kept outside and kept inferior, because on the one hand, while they may be demons, nevertheless Scripture requires us to not entirely remove them. I would suggest that it doesn't do so entirely. And that's because this picture, according to which a Jewish collectivity stripped of political and military capacities and therefore rendered harmless, would subsequently be left alone to practice its rituals, leaves out one element, final element, which I want to discuss, very prevalent in the theology both of Hezbollah and of the larger Iranian and pro-Iranian Shia Islamist world of which it is a part. And that is the eschatological or end of days element. In the quote of Nasrallah, which I read at the beginning, it should be noted this is not merely a generalized call for the destruction of the Jews, rather it is outlining a very specific end times scenario. Let me just find the quote again. I won't trouble you by reading all of it again, but just so we remember what we were talking about. But I'll tell you, among the signs and signals which guide us, you remember he said in the Islamic prophecies, is this state of Israel will be established, and the Jews will gather from all parts of the world, not to bring about the Antichrist, but rather that Allah wants to save you from having to go to the ends of the earth, for they've gathered in one place, and there the final and decisive battle will take place. Right? Remember, I read that out at the beginning. So what end times scenario is Nasrallah discussing here? It is the scenario according to which the 12th Imam, or Imam Mahdi, returns to earth, and in 12 or Imami Shiism, there is a focus on this figure of the 12th Imam, Muhammad al-Mahdi, who tradition claims disappeared or went into occultation in the year 873. And the notion is that the Mahdi's return will result in a series of battles between the Mahdi himself and his forces and a figure called Abu Sufyan, who is identified as an Arab ruler hostile to the Mahdi. And then finally, after Abu Sufyan is defeated, with the Dajjal, the deceiver or Antichrist, often associated with the West or with Israel in contemporary Shia Islamist writing. And the Mahdi will be victorious, and he will then establish a messianic state encompassing the world. I'm quoting now from a writer called David Cook in a 2011 essay entitled Messianism in the Shiite Crescent. Cook says the following: the Dajjal, or Antichrist, is another key figure in the apocalyptic literature. And since the Dajjal is said to be a Jew, contemporary writers often use this figure to inject anti-Semitic conspiracy thinking into mainstream apocalyptic writings. The Dajjal was virtually absent in traditional Shiite writings, though nowadays the figure is gaining more and more prominence in contemporary Shiite apocalyptic materials. Indeed, Dajjal stories have become loci for demonizing the West as a whole, which is routinely portrayed as the embodiment of the Antichrist. Furthermore, anti-Semitic references to the Dajjal regularly appear today in Shiite apocalyptic literature. Only a few years ago, such references were non-existent. Shiite apocalyptic thinking was prominent during the 1979 revolution in Iran. It then declined, and it was revived very much during the presidency of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who people here probably remember as 15, 16 years ago was when we began to see a revival of this. And Cook says, while Shiite Islam has always possessed an elaborate literature concerning the Mahdi, Never before had this literature been as copious, publicly available, detailed or socially explosive as it is today. Hezbollah routinely utilizes tropes that are traditionally Shiite, and the movement traditionally placed fairly little evidence, or emphasis rather, on the issue of the Mahdi, and this began to change about 15 years ago, when a flood of books about the Mahdi began to spring from the popular presses of Beirut. It's interesting to note that another watershed with regard to stories about the Mahdi and this end of days element finding its way towards the center in Hezbollah's outlook was the 2006 war against Israel, the Israel-Hezbollah war of 2006. There is a kind of cottage industry of stories, books, articles, and so on regarding supposed appearances of the Mahdi on the battlefields of the 2006 war. Because of lack of time, I guess I won't go into detail about the story. I was going to read you one of these little stories translated, but I won't, because I want to save some time for our discussion. Only to say, I guess maybe précis the story, and to say what it describes. It's the story of a Hezbollah fighter operating in southern Lebanon, who comes across a man giving off rays of light. This is the way in which the man is described. And he asks the man, "Who are you? What are you doing here?" The man says, "I'm the Imam al-Hujjah, your master. I appear by the permission of God to our supporters whenever I wish and in whatever place, and I want to speak with you." And the story says, the guy says, "My master, I'm not alone. There are other fighters in the position." And then the man guides the Mahdi, for he it is, to the other fighters. And the quote is from the story directly: "Just at that moment, the Zionists approached with their tanks and bulldozers. And when Israeli missiles began to rain towards the three fighters, the Mahdi pointed with his hand, and one of the missiles fell upon an Israeli tank instead. Then the three fighters began to attack the other tanks, and one of them succeeded in firing an RPG right at it and destroyed it. And then the Imam called out to the fighters, saying to them, 'Now retreat.' And the fighters retreated, but they were victorious with his divine help." Let me just say in parentheses that this fighter was not the only one who was present in the Hezbollah war against Israel in 2006, because your humble speaker was also present in the same battlefields. And I must say I was not witness. I maybe disappoint you by saying I personally was not witness to any appearances by Imam Mahdi in the course of the fighting. To conclude with regard to this final bit, this element of messianic thinking in Hezbollah is paralleled by similar trends in Iraq and elsewhere. I think it shouldn't be ignored, and I think it calls into question whether Amal Saad Ghorayeb's view of Hezbollah as envisaging Tasakun al-Barid, cold coexistence, can be sustained. Final part before we begin our discussion, and maybe the most crucial final small section of all. Hezbollah, as we well know, is not a debating club. It is a movement or organization committed to killing of Jews. So it's important, therefore, to look at some of the theory and thinking I've been discussing in the practical context, and to ask, what does this actually mean in terms of the movement's behavior? I'd like, therefore, to just give a few examples from the movement's earliest days of its activities against Jews, both Lebanese and Israeli and others. It's a little bit of a list, so that we remember, I suppose. Hezbollah kidnapped 9 Jews in 1985, including Yitzhak Sasson, the leader of the Jewish community in Lebanon at that time, and Dr. Eli Halak, the community doctor. Yitzhak Sasson was taken at gunpoint on March 31st, 1985, on his way from the Beirut International Airport after a trip to Abu Dhabi. These abductees were murdered, and their bodies have never been found. The most catastrophic attack to date against Jews, as Jews, by Hezbollah was the July 18th, 1994 vehicle-borne suicide bombing at the Amia Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires, Argentina. 86 people were killed and more than 300 injured. And this attack, as we now know, was ordered by Iranian government leaders and coordinated by Iranian intelligence and executed by Hezbollah. While choosing targets abroad, Hezbollah operatives routinely undertake hostile reconnaissance against Jewish individuals and community locations worldwide, including in Europe, including in Britain. You're going to visit the CST, I think, in the course of the next few days, the Community Security Trust here in the UK, and they'll be able to tell you more, although hopefully not too much, about that and about their activities in that regard. In October 2019, 2 Iranian operatives pleaded guilty in the US to spying on behalf of Iran. They were charged with collecting information on Jewish and Israeli targets in the US and on opponents of the Iranian regime. One of the operatives undertook hostile reconnaissance against Jewish religious and cultural centers in Chicago, taking photographs of security around the buildings. In March 2017, a German court convicted a Pakistani national on charges of spying for Iran's Quds Force after he'd taken pictures and collected information on Jewish and Israeli possible targets for attack in Germany and in France. The list is longer than that, of course. That's just a taster. But that's in order to remind us that this is not merely a matter of theorizing and hostile ideology, but also a matter of hostile practice. To sum up then and to conclude, the Lebanese Hezbollah organization adheres to an ideology which has at its core a version of anti-Zionism which is inherently anti-Jewish, locating what it regards as the criminal nature of Zionism and Israel in what it sees as the uniquely evil and iniquitous nature of the Jews. And while on an ideological level this version of anti-Semitism may differ from other contemporary versions of both anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, in practice this ideological formulation is accompanied by the adoption of the movement of more familiar tropes of modern anti-Semitism, including, as we saw, Holocaust denial. As an Islamic movement, Hezbollah is required to deal with the notion that the Jews are a people of the book and therefore entitled to an ordered, if subordinate, role in an Islamic society. Hezbollah spokesmen do this by taking a minimal interpretation of this role for Jews as opposed to for Christians, according to which Jews will be left unmolested under Islamic rule without being permitted to take an equal or active role in society and under permanent suspicion and hostility. However, as we saw, the growth in popularity of messianic and eschatological thinking in Hezbollah statements and publications over the last decade and a half indicate that even this fate appears to be considered excessively positive for the Jews in Hezbollah's view. Instead, the increasingly popular view sees the Jews as part of an upcoming final battle between good and evil, which will end with their final defeat and destruction. And finally, once again, in closing, just to reiterate, it's important to remember that this anti-Semitic Islamist outlook has consequences not only on the rhetorical level, rather it dictates Hezbollah's praxis as a global terrorist organization. That is, when selecting targets, Hezbollah makes no effort at differentiating between Israeli official facilities and personnel and Jewish communal buildings and Jews who are non-citizens of Israel. That is, Hezbollah's outlook leads to the murder and the attempted murder of Jews worldwide, and this is the logical destination and conclusion of the outlook discussed here. And on that note, I'll be happy to be quiet, and we have some time left for discussion and comments. And thank you.
Jonathan, thank you very much. Brilliant as always. Thank you. Thank you very much. Sami?
Thank you very much. You mentioned that the drug dealing that they are allowed to do in Islam. If you consume drugs, you are condemned to death. But you can poison somebody else if it's an infidel. Mm-hmm. That goes to why Hezbollah has partnered with the drug cartels in Latin America, okay, in order to poison many people, including Americans. They are dealing with fentanyl also. Yes. So they are partners on the killing of 100,000 Americans. But there's another subject on terrorism on American soil. In 2006, Hezbollah planned to blow up JFK Airport. Okay, and those plotters were condemned to life in prison. A couple of them are still in prison in Brooklyn. Now, this is a dangerous thing to the United States. It's not just a danger to Israel over there. It's a danger to the United States. Why isn't the United States, even though they have condemned it and done many things, why haven't they actually gone to war, for example, on Hezbollah? That Hezbollah has already declared war on the United States.
Yeah, well, it's a good question. First of all, good number of points. I mean, first of all, with regard to the issue of drugs, it's worth pointing out, certainly in Islam, their use and their sale is forbidden. It's a fact that Hezbollah, and not only Hezbollah, but also Iran and the Syrian regime, the regime of Bashar Assad, those three partners in particular are engaged together, not only in drug smuggling and sales in the United States, you mentioned, it's correct, but also in the Middle East itself. Captagon specifically, sale of Captagon, is an absolutely crucial economic component for the Syrian regime and for Hezbollah in gaining income for the purchase of weapons. And the fascinating thing is that these drugs are being sold mainly in the Gulf. They say mainly to Muslims, Sunni Muslims, but mainly to Muslims. The drugs are produced in Lebanon, transported from Syria into Jordan, and then down into the Gulf. And this is one of the most central sources of income for these organizations today. And new information we're discovering shows us the extent of cooperation in this regard. It's Hezbollah and Assad together, but the operation is controlled by the Iranians. So it's a very important point, and you're absolutely right. With regard to the United States, and why does it not wish to go to war with Hezbollah? Well, it's a very good way of putting it, because of course Hezbollah has already gone to war with the United States. That's to say, for I think everybody from the United States here, I think there are quite a number of people from the United States here, will be familiar with the killing by Hezbollah of over 200 United States Marines in 1983 in southern Lebanon. As they, the most deadly terror attack that Hezbollah has carried out until today was carried out not against Israelis, not against Jews, not against civilians, but against members of the United States Marine Corps. So Hezbollah has already declared war. It's a fascinating question. Why has the United States not declared war back? I mean, my sense is that whilst the United States has carried out effective acts of war, maybe not against Hezbollah, but against the Iranian masters, I think, for what it's worth, that the United States has been carrying out a policy based entirely on illusions with regard to Lebanese Hezbollah and its masters in Tehran for more than a decade. The Obama administration, less so Trump, but he wasn't immune as well, but now Biden once again, have the notion that this regime and its many proxies, such as Hezbollah, can be turned through inducements into a normal actor on the regional and global stage. And this is an illusion. But this is an illusion that's hard dying. Eh? It doesn't seem to die. You know? And so I think the administration, current administration too, is still operating from within this illusion. And for as long as they do so, policy will not make sense. Listen, I don't want to go on too long with more questions, but I look at this stuff very closely. The Iranians and Hezbollah have killed in the last 8 months or 9 months now, 2 American citizens. One, a man called Stephen Troll, was shot dead in Baghdad in November 2022. In March, the Shia militias killed a US contractor outside a base in Hasaka in northern Syria. 2 other guys were wounded. There's been other attacks on US positions. They are conducting a kind of low-level insurgency against the United States, and the United States is not responding because its policy outlook is severely flawed.
Yeah. Also, recently I was in Saudi Arabia a few times, and the Saudis are complaining that the drugs are poisoning the young people.
Yeah. The Saudis are the main target.
Yeah.
Saudis and the small Gulf monarchies, these are the main target of the Captagon. Yeah. Sure.
I wanted to ask, you didn't share a lot of their expressions of current days, but more of older times. And I wonder, so I hear a lot people who would count as pro-Palestinians and anti-Zionists seeing Hezbollah and Hamas as freedom fighters. So I just wonder what are your thoughts regarding this, and in what way do you think you brought up and explained the different understanding of their anti-Zionism or anti-Semitism? In what way do you think they actually influence the public opinion about anti-Semitism and relationship to Israel and Jewish people?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. Yeah, you're right that many of the early quotes were from some time ago. Towards the end of the talk, my last one is from 2020. Yeah, sure. No, I'm not, but this is a fair point. Look, with regard to people who regard them as freedom fighters, what can we do? I mean, you just have to bring the information which I've brought in the course of this talk is not something which I invented myself. This is all easily examined, easily checked, easily sourced. So if somebody wants to go through this evidence and then at the end of that say, yeah, as far as I'm concerned, that's all interesting, but actually these people are essentially a group of freedom fighters who seek freedom and are not prejudiced, what can you do? At that point, there's not much more to discuss. The person, I would suggest, at that point is not arguing in good faith, I think the expression is. So what can we do? We have to just get this information out there as best we can so that those people who are interested in arguing in good faith, which I believe to be nevertheless the majority of people, including people who maybe for this or that reason have been taken in by the messaging of these movements and their supporters, so that they can realize what is really going on here. It's not controversial. I mean, of course, one can locate elements among pro-Palestinian opinion and among Palestinians themselves who are opposed to Israel's establishment, but who nevertheless are genuinely, at least in themselves, convinced that they're anti-racists, that they are universalists and so on. Yeah, Hezbollah is not like that. Even we saw in the course of the talk, even Amal Saad Ghorayeb, who is herself a supporter of Hezbollah, she supports this movement, yeah? We'll say, absolutely, of course it's an anti-Jewish movement, an anti-Judaic movement. It's really not controversial. So one simply needs to get the information out there. As regarding the last very fascinating bit of your question where you asked, and what impact does this have? I must tell you that my impression is that it has, from the narrow point of view of information campaigning, of hearts and minds, so to speak, which is what you ask about, from our point of view, it has a very positive effect, actually. That is to say, from the narrow point of view of Israeli information campaigning, the fact that more and more of the enemy are actually Islamists today, as opposed to people who pretend to be universalists and liberals and leftists or whatever, actually is a good thing. It's not a good thing if you have to fight them, because fighting is not nice, huh? But in terms of information campaigning, it's good. Why? Because Islamists tend to be people that many people in the West don't like very much, are not taken in by, don't want to listen to. So the fact that, for example, Hamas controls Gaza, we see here in the UK, every time there's a campaign against Hamas, there's demonstrations outside the Israeli embassy and so on. But I do note the fact that the vast majority of participants in those demonstrations are themselves Muslims. That's to say, the kind of big penumbra of Western leftists and liberals, which would be there for Fatah and there for the PLO and therefore, is not really there for these movements. So actually, from a certain point of view, the revelation of the Islamist nature of much of Israel's enemies is good from an Israeli point of view. At least it gets into clarity who exactly is doing this stuff.
And actually, just as a footnote, Joel Kotek was circulating a speech by Judith Butler where she supports Hezbollah.
She does, yeah. She says, Judith Butler said the following, I'm going to quote directly, she said that they are movements part of the global left.
The progressive global.
Part of the progressive global left, which is really, again, at a certain point, I don't know, I wouldn't know how to respond to that. In the same sense, I remember someone once saying that, if you ask someone what's 2 plus 2, and the person answers 2 plus 2 is 5, you have a basis for discussion, eh? But if you ask what's 2 plus 2, and the person says 2 plus 2 is 5,054, you're like, okay, with this, apparently we have no basis for communication. And this kind of statement, to me, as a student of this stuff, is along those lines.